Good evening, this is woodblock printmaker Dave Bull here in our shop in Asakusa. Tonight's video is the next episode in the David's Choice series, where I take items from the shop here or from my own print collection and try and explain why I find them interesting. Every day people from many different countries visit this shop. It's kind of a self-selected group. Those who have no interest in such things as woodblock prints, of course, just walk on by down the street, while those who do might come in. So it's not surprising that we frequently hear comments like, I find Japanese prints so beautiful from our visitors. But whenever I hear this, I can't help but think to myself, I wonder just what it is that they are seeing when they say that. What is it about these scraps of colored paper, like James Minchin used to describe them, that they find beautiful? Now, back in the days when I held annual exhibitions of my prints, I used to see a common type of behavior from the people visiting. I had prints mounted along the walls, and visitors would approach the first one, stop in front of it, look for a while, and then move along to the next one. But as they moved along the length of the gallery wall, the time they spent in front of each print would get shorter and shorter, until by the time they had seen 10 prints or so, they were no longer even stopping in front of each one, but kept moving slowly by, feet constantly in motion. It would happen then that the person would then approach me and comment about the beautiful work. It's very interesting. Thank you very much. And when I heard this, I respond politely, of course, but sometimes couldn't help thinking to myself, I spent 3 months making every one of those prints. Your feet actually barely stopped while you were looking at them. Just what actually did you see there? Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not upset about this. I'm not complaining. This move along behavior, it's simply a reflection of how much data we can take in before getting a bit overloaded. I do the same thing in the same situation. So what am I getting at? It's this. In this video, we're going to have a Japanese print exhibition. And when I say Japanese print, that's exactly what I mean. Imagine walking into a gallery and seeing not dozens of prints on the walls, not 10 prints, but just one. That will be the content of our little exhibition this evening. Will we find enough things in one simple image to keep your feet from wandering? Let's see. In a previous video just a few weeks ago, I talked about the Meiji-era kuchi-e, those frontispieces sometimes inserted into magazines of the day in an attempt to make the magazines more attractive to purchasers. I myself made a reproduction of one such print and talked about it then. And today I want to show you another kuchi-e from my collection. This was designed by Mizuno Toshi Gaara and published in August of 1896. Toshi Gaara was a regular contributor to the world of kuchi-e, so I assumed that the consumers liked his work and the publishers kept asking him for more. The print shows its provenance as a frontispiece in the creases still present. Look at this. We can see how it was folded to fit the magazine dimensions. It would have been stapled in place on the right-hand side when the magazine was being bound, and then trimmed on the other side along with all the other pages. Now, when you look at the design, perhaps the first thing you notice is that this seems to be a few separate pieces of paper kind of layered together. The woman's figure seems to be on a square sheet here on the right. Look at the texture. Is it cloth? But she also extends beyond the square. What's happening? And this poem here on the left, it seems to be on a thin, translucent sheet mounted on top of the print. You can see the forms of the flowers right through this. But no, all of this is an illusion. The men who designed and made this print were just playing with us. This is a single, unbroken sheet of paper, and all those different forms and shapes are just patterns carved on wood blocks and then printed. The paper itself is extremely thin. This is not a high quality luxurious paper of the type used for top quality ukiyo-e work. This was very much a mass produced item, and keeping the costs down must have been a very high priority for the publisher. The paper is so thin that you almost get as good view from the back side as you do from the front. Now, thin it might be, but please remember that during the printing process, it takes place with the paper in a damp condition, and it has to be incredibly strong to withstand the pressure of our tool, the baron, which is rubbed over the back of the sheet with very high force. Not just once, but again and again and again for each and every one of the many impressions. I've looked at this carefully and tried to figure out just how many impressions it took to make this print, and my best guess is somewhere around 40. Now, let's dig in. Where do we start? The poem sheet here on the left is as good a place as any. We've already noted that there's an illusion of translucency here, and they achieved that by printing the whole area of the poem sheet in a very light grey, and then printing the shapes of the underlying plants in a slightly darker tone, in exactly the right location to make us feel that they are continuous objects. And both of these greys are done as gradations, and this makes it look like the poem sheet is not lying flat but is slightly lifted up at the bottom. And look at this. Down here on the bottom there are some swirls embossed into the sheet. Now, a lady of this type would never be writing poetry on a plain blank sheet of paper. She would be using a specially prepared decorative sheet. And the one they're showing us here is obviously toned on the back with a delicate vermilion wash, and it's embossed with that pattern of moving water. Now, the calligraphy itself is wonderfully expressive. I know the carvers of this era were so good at capturing the flow of the brush as it moves over the sheet. People seeing such calligraphy in a woodblock print, they're always surprised to hear that it's carved. It just looks so natural. There is something else about this calligraphy though that stunned me when I first noticed it. Picture somebody using a Japanese brush. They'll roll the tip onto the inkstone, load it with ink, then begin to write. Now, the initial touch of brush to paper comes out quite deep and dark, but as the ink gradually flows from the brush, subsequent writing becomes lighter and fainter. Here's a sample of some old calligraphy I found on a Google search. You can see where the strokes get fainter after each initial touch. Now, when we reproduce calligraphy in a woodblock print, it's different. The lettering is carved on a flat piece of wood. Our pigment application swirls the ink around all over it, and the rubbing tool then presses down on the paper. It's all flat, as you can see in this example of calligraphy from one of the prints from my Long 100 Poems series. It's flat, flat, flat. But look at this kuchi-e. Every line of calligraphy starts dark and tapers off. They've gone to the supreme trouble of printing a gradation on each separate line of poetry, probably doing the entire poem first in a faint grey, then doing a second impression with dabs of darker ink at the top of each line. I have to mention, it's not perfect. The printer tried to hit here to catch the start of this line, but moved his brush just a bit too widely and it banged on each side, places where there shouldn't be a darker tone. But good grief, like I'm going to quibble about that? Remember, that guy was just churning through his stack of paper, one sheet, next sheet, bang, bang, bang. It's absolutely incredible that they would go to such trouble as to produce these gradations. Did the consumers of the day notice this, or did they just flip the page and get busy reading the stories in the magazine? Okay, where do we go next? The background tones. It would have been completely acceptable to print just a nice flat background tone across the sheet, but no, they've done it with 3 different impressions. A green light gradation up from this lower corner, a faint orange vermilion gradation from the top right, and then a slightly darker vermilion tone built up on top of that with a different block, so it makes a pattern here. Just it goes on and on and on. But anyway, let's get to the meat now, the depiction of the lady about to write her own poem on the card on her desk. As I mentioned, the designer has put her into this separate little area, which, by the way, is not outlined with simple straight lines, but with strokes that clearly show their origin in the brush at every start and end point. And of course, the carver has caught this. There's no rulers permitted here. Let's look more closely at the textured background. This is the technique called nuno mezuri, printing in imitation of a cloth pattern. There were 2 ways to do this, and I'm not quite sure which one was used here. I would have to see another copy of the print for inspection to be able to tell. One way to do this was to use actual cloth. The overall shape would be carved in the wood first, and cloth was then fastened to the surface with a rosin or waxy surface substance. The paper was then rubbed over this to pick up the cloth pattern. It gives a very natural effect, but the downside is that the cloth, even though it's hardened somewhat by that rosin, pretty soon gets flattened under this repeated pressure and has to be renewed. For kuchi-e prints, which were needed in the tens of thousands of copies, that would be a deal killer. So I suspect this one was done by carving. Cutting those little tiny squares, that's an easy way to do it. That's ridiculous. They cut 2 separate blocks, one for the horizontal lines and one for the vertical lines. Easy to carve. And then at printing time, boom, boom, boom. The 2 blocks were just printed in the normal way, but without pigment. They overlapped to result in an embossed pattern like the one you see here. Now the figure. almost nothing in this part of the print is done in flat color. They have used gradations in the tassels, in her under kimono, in her main over kimono, as well as a gradation. And that's really difficult to do because of the cutout pattern. And then in this section here, they've done it twice, once from the bottom and once again down from the top. On her poem card, they've used metallic pigments, something that was prior to this era only seen on surimono, expensive prints produced for private distribution. It was inconceivable for mass market items such as this. We also see metallics used in some of her hair ornaments. There's also a really good one. This will need the paper to be held at an angle to catch the light. I'll do this later with the camera. This thing totally disappears in a photograph or scan, or when the print is looked at in a normal room light. But they've used extensively the technique known as front rubbing, shomenzuri, to create glossy highlighted areas. Here on her obi, down here on the inkstone, and of course up in her hair. Now, how was this done? Actually, it's quite simple. Normal printing, it's done with blocks, cut to shape, rubbed with pigment. The paper goes on face down, and the back is rubbed to make the transfer. But front rubbing, as you can guess from the name, is done the other way. This obi, the purple obi here, would have been printed in the normal way first to create the purple color. Then later, after all the other printing is finished and the paper is dried, another block is used. But that block is not carved in reverse like normal printing blocks. It's carved in non-reversed orientation. And the paper, now dry, is placed face up on that block, and the front is then burnished with our Baron rubbing tool. And bingo, a wonderful shiny gloss appears in that area. It helps if a bit of glue is mixed into the pigment at the time of first printing so that a stronger gloss can appear. And look at this. The front rubbing block for the hair has had fine hairlines cut into it, so that after all the rubbing is done, a beautiful pattern of flowing hair comes to life. And now I guess we get to the part that for me is the unquestioned heart of this print, the face and the hair. I'm not sure what I can say about this isn't already obvious to you. Delicate? Of course. Beautifully smooth, evenly carved? Of course. Did I mention delicate? A hair mask like this takes about 5 impressions. First comes the key block, which contains the actual hairs we can see at the edge bordering her face. This is of course printed very softly. A base grey tone then comes over that, and this is followed by the same block printed in darker black, but wiped off at the edge of the face to create a gradation. The rich black then comes on top of that, also wiped off with a gradation at the edge. And then to finish it off, as I mentioned a moment ago, after the paper is dried, the front rubbing comes on to give it a shiny gloss. Another interesting point about that part of it, is that the designer, Toshi Gaara, he didn't draw what you see here. He drew the picture that you see, the outlines, the nose, the eyes, all the straight, everything that's there. But he didn't draw the hairs. You can't draw them like this with a brush. He would have just put a grey wash in there to show what kind of shape and style he wanted, and maybe a few individual hairs just to show the shape of it overall. And the rest was up to the carver, who knew exactly what to do given those confines and that guidance. Well, there we have it. And now that we have inspected it quite closely, let me remind you again of what this was. It was a freebie, a print stapled into the front of a cheap magazine to help boost sales. And most of the people who took this home from the newsstand in August of 1896 would have glanced at it and then got busy reading the stories, tossing the thing aside when they were finished. A number of these prints did end up getting preserved, of course. I'm sure that some people pulled them out before throwing the magazine away, and those are the copies that we now find in our used bookshops or popping up on auction sites, where I got this one. I'll never know who she was, the lady who, perhaps on the spur of the moment, decided to tear this one out and put it in a drawer before throwing away the magazine. Could she have ever imagined that her print would one day be featured like this, that people all over the world would be seeing it and learning from it? Of course she couldn't. But I am, as you might expect, very, very grateful to her. So much pleasure for me, and now for so many other people too. So there you have it. I'm kind of biased about this stuff, of course, but I honestly think that this print and others of this type, they're among the most beautiful things ever created by the hand of man. There's no complicated tools, no machines at all, and no pretension to high art. It's just a handful of men going about their daily routine work in the production of something to be used as a casual part of people's daily lives. But the combination of their efforts came together in something like this that is absolutely a breathtaking creation, the likes of which I suspect we will never see again. Can you imagine a dozen or so of these on the wall in the gallery? It would be a kind of a trap. You know, people would come in, they'd start to walk along, their feet would stop. They'd never get out of there. I think that's enough for now. I hope you've enjoyed this little presentation. Thank you for your time. And from now on, of course, I mustn't neglect to extend a special thanks to the supporters of the new Patreon page we opened last week. That has jumped out to a spectacular start, and I myself and all of us at Mokohankan here are very grateful and very appreciative of this show of support for our work. Good night, and I'll see you again very soon, I hope.